In memory of JK Rowling. She ain't dead, but she killed her own career by proudly hating trans people, and no one would really miss her that much anyway. For half a decade, Harry Potter author JK Rowling experienced a cultural establishment collapse over her views on transgender ideology. But what isn't understood, and what I'll demonstrate, is that she never lost the general public. For a while, she was both the most liked author in the English-speaking world, and the most institutionally ostracized cultural figure of the modern age. This year, the cultural winds shifted away from the more doctrinaire views of trans ideology. 2025 has seen the gradual vindication of JK Rowling. The two tracks, public approval versus cultural establishment approval. Beginning in 2020, cultural establishment approval of JK Rowling collapsed, and stayed collapsed. This is the track the media, academia, and the arts live on. In elite cultural spaces, the people who define reputational legitimacy, editors, literary critics, festival organizers, arts boards, shifted dramatically left on gender issues between roughly 2015 to 2020. Rowling's stance triggered institutional disavowals. The young stars of the Harry Potter films, most notably Emma Watson, openly opposed her views. This produced what felt like a massive reputational implosion. But here's the important distinction. It was only inside that class. Media is structurally biased toward the cultural establishment view. Corporations and arts institutions optimize for elite approval, not public approval. A look at the data reveals the extent to which, throughout the whole affair, Rowling remained a widely liked author with enduring cultural influence. According to Morning Consult, Rowling's net favorability among US adults in 2018 versus 2022 fell by 23 points. Among millennials, her net favorability was down 31 points, and among Gen Z, 36 points. However, even at this low point, she still retained a net favorability. A follow-up Morning Consult piece in April 2023 found that among self-identified Harry Potter fans, the share with a very favorable opinion of Rowling rose from 34% to 40% in about a year. In Britain, YouGov's entertainment polling showed in September 2024, 41% of Britons said they liked JK Rowling, 21% disliked, and 31% were neutral, with a net positive of 20 points. In YouGov's 2025 all-time writers' ratings, 58% gave a positive opinion of Rowling and only 16% negative. Electoral Calculus ran an April 2025 survey on sex and gender. One question was explicitly, do you approve or disapprove of author JK Rowling's efforts to help fund organizations that advocate for women-only spaces? 47% approved and only 18% disapproved, for a net approval of 29 points. Emergence of a dissenter. Rowling first came under fire in early June 2020 for tweets she posted about transgender ideology. Months earlier, she had tweeted her support for Maya Forstater, a tax specialist who'd lost her job for what were deemed transphobic tweets. Rowling tweeted, "Dress however you please, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real? Stand with Maya." Half a year later, she retweeted an obscure op-ed piece that discussed people who menstruate, in reference to a woman's global health initiative. People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those people. Someone help me out. Wumben, Wimpund, Wumud, she wrote. The Forstater tweet was the opening rupture. The menstruation tweet was the explosive escalation that brought global attention. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. I respect every trans person's right to live any way that feels authentic and comfortable to them. I'd march with you if you were discriminated against on the basis of being trans. At the same time, my life has been shaped by being female. I do not believe it's hateful to say so. The messaging had several layers that were bound to confuse casual observers. How were they supposed to pass what seemed like someone making a painstaking effort to validate the rights of trans people to secure dignity and be safe from discrimination, while also seeming to invalidate their claim to the gender they had transitioned to? People weren't sure where her solidarity ended and exclusionary notions began. She followed up a few days later with a lengthy post, taking issue with one of the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. I've read all the arguments about femaleness not residing in the sexed body, and the assertions that biological women don't have common experiences, and I find them deeply misogynistic and regressive. It's been clear to me for a while that the new trans activism is having, or is likely to have, if all its demands are met, a significant impact on many of the causes I support, because it's pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. She also cited contributing factors to rapid onset gender dysphoria, quoting a researcher that there was a rise in peer group identification. "I want to be very clear here," she said. "I know transition will be a solution for some gender dysphoric people, although I'm also aware through extensive research that studies have consistently shown that between 60 to 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria. Again and again I've been told to just meet some trans people. I have. In addition to a few younger people, who were all adorable, I happen to know a self-described transsexual woman who's older than I am and wonderful. I've always found it hard to think of her as anything other than a woman. Being older, though, she went through a long and rigorous process of evaluation, psychotherapy, and staged transformation. The current explosion of trans activism is urging a removal of almost all the robust systems through which candidates for sex reassignment were once required to pass. When you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he is a woman, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. That is the simple truth. But the post was too long, on a strangely obscure page, given little media attention, and seemed, in some respects, just an expanded expression of the mixed messaging the broader, distracted public hadn't really got the gist of. Sometimes she was going out of her way to seem considerate and measured, other times seeming to dash off drolly, flippant remarks. What were people supposed to make of this inconsistent tone? She was trying to say, simultaneously, of course trans rights are human rights, and of course trans lives matter, and trans people deserve empathy and protections, but trans ideology should be fiercely contested, and anyone is entitled to transition in order to feel their authentic self. But no one should be compelled to recognize the authenticity such trans people feel. And transition should not be encouraged or allowed for youth. But adult transitioners are sometimes acceptable. But such adult transitioners should be denied access to biological women's spaces, without it being clear if there was a distinction between non-physically transitioned transgender people and fully physically transitioned transgender people entering such spaces. The public were unlikely to get all of that at once. What they could get all at once was the pushback from trans activists and allies. After Obergefell legalized gay marriage at the federal level in the United States, the trans movement seemed a bit like an addendum to that multi-generational narrative of gay liberation. Desire for integration was in the wind. Trans rights were experiencing a cultural moment in entertainment. Allyship was seen as taken as a given in respectable cosmopolitan society. Was there not something poignant about youngsters faced with every possible disincentive to want to declare themselves as trans, familial, socially, culturally, and the daunting process of transition itself? And in the face of all that, these stubbornly determined young voices were finally being heeded? It felt like bracing social change. This was part of a pattern in which Rowling's sustained broad public support was lost among the opposition from those with the platforms for shaping cultural narratives. The huge online petition of authors and creative professionals had in fact been preceded by a more subdued posting. Acclaimed playwright Tom Stoppard, Booker Prize-winning author Ian McEwan, and actress Frances Barber were among the signatories to a letter in which they claimed Rowling was a victim of an insidious, authoritarian, and misogynistic trend in social media. But it didn't get much media traction. There was also, though it never seemed so at the time, a steady stream of high-profile actors and celebrities coming to Rowling's side. The list, when strung together, is formidable. Jim Broadbent. I think she is amazing. I would support her. John Cleese. adds name to list of cultural figures supporting JK Rowling. It's horrendous. Helena Bonham Carter defends JK Rowling. Eddie Izzard defends JK Rowling. Rafe Fiennes defends JK Rowling, saying abuse she receives is disgusting. Robbie Coltrane defends JK Rowling in Trans Row. Eddie Redmayne condemns vitriol aimed at JK Rowling after her trans rights comments. Tom Felton expresses support for JK Rowling despite controversy over her views on trans issues. But at the time, all of this was too piecemeal, scattered across various outlets, and didn't cohere into a solid counter-narrative, and its messaging was a bit muddled. Though many were outright in agreement with the broad sentiments she was expressing, the public seemed to get the sense that these celebs might not be necessarily supporting Rowling's views. Rather, they seemed to be condemning the harsh vitriol with which her views were being attacked, which is a different thing, and also allowed those celebs to make a point about discourse and civility without being dragged completely into partisanship in the culture war. There was also a counter-petition that garnered a hefty 23,000 signatures in support of Rowling, but the anti-Rowling pro-trans statement, though only having 1,500 signatories, was chock-a-block full of industry professionals, especially in publishing. It carried more weight and impact because it seemed to directly reflect a groundswell of sentiment within the cultural establishment. But no one then, or up till now, has actually bothered to look into those signatories. And as it happens, what constitutes authors and editors actually includes a ton of fairly modest profiled people, copywriters, cover graphic designers, and even a load of librarians. But it cut through into the public consciousness because the cultural establishment covered it in a semi-synchronous way. And if these novelists and publishers, who tend to be regarded as educated, sensitive, and humanist, and ply their trade exploring and reflecting the human condition, were from the same walk of life and profession as Rowling, then it didn't look good. Then, 4 authors represented by JK Rowling's literary agency resigned after accusing the company of declining to issue a public statement of support for transgender rights. 3 of them, Fox Fisher, Drew Davies, and Ugla Stefania Jones-Dauteur, said they could no longer work with the Blair Partnership, the London-based agency that represents all aspects of Rowling's work. They had asked the agency to reaffirm their commitment to transgender rights and equality. In its response, a spokesman for the Blair Partnership said it would always champion diverse voices and believe in freedom of speech for all, but it was not willing to have staff re-educated to meet the demands of a small group of clients. 4 authors stepping aside seemed like an indictment of Rowling, but again, no one then, or until now, has actually bothered to look up these people. In doing so, I'm not interested in reducing them to caricature. These are simply the most accessible platforms they have. And it's all heavily trans-activist, LGBT-themed material. They could find representation elsewhere, but that door didn't swing both ways. A hypothetical handful of authors departing a highly progressive partnership over fidelity to their conservative views would likely have struggled to find subsequent representation anywhere. Out on her own. Rowling occupied a strange ideological position, perfect for progressives to attack, but not quite suited for conservatives to champion. That left her exposed. Her ideological profile didn't fit the right's identity politics template, which typically embraces dissidents who fit a familiar model. Culturally conservative, skeptical of progressivism across the board, and aligned with traditionalist or libertarian worldviews. Rowling is not that figure. She is pro-gay rights, outside the gender identity debates, an outspoken feminist, and left liberal on almost every axis except the definition of biological sex. She is essentially a mainstream progressive with one major heterodox position. That makes her significant to the left as a traitor figure, but not suited to the right as a standard-bearer. Much of the right will be leery of champions who agree with them only on one issue and attack them everywhere else. In fact, as if to make it clear, Rowling had written, "Never have I seen women denigrated and dehumanized to the extent they are now. From the leader of the free world's long history of sexual assault accusations and his proud boast of grabbing them by the pussy, to the incel, involuntary celibate, movement that rages against women who won't give them sex. Everywhere, women are being told to shut up and sit down or else. She never signaled a broader ideological realignment, framed herself as fighting wokeism in a generalized sense, or attacked feminism or left liberal values. Right-wing outlets love the defector, left-to-right conversion, the martyr, cancelled conservative, and the outsider, anti-establishment populist. Rowling did not play any of those roles. To conservatives, she was a single-issue dissenter. She didn't deliver a sufficient cultural script. She was not available for co-option. Also, right-wing audiences were already accustomed to seeing Harry Potter as liberal-coded. The fantasy tropes align more with liberal humanism than with conservative moralism. Lastly, she didn't suffer the kind of cancellation the right knows how to weaponize. Rowling is fabulously wealthy. The left tried to destroy her symbolically, not economically. For right-wing media, that's less emotionally potent. They prefer heroes who are economically crushed by the left, someone needing rescue. Rowling never needed saving. She ended up in a unique geopolitical space. Too progressive for the right, too biologically realist for the left. This left her, almost uniquely, someone with a staggering profile who at the same time was largely out on her own. It's one of the most fascinating cases of ideological isolation in modern cultural history. There was a year or two when Rowling's stature seemed to teeter. In this phase, she was, for many, effectively cancelled, excised. The matter was irreconcilable. She was a pariah who had squandered her cultural icon status so unaccountably, so doggedly, so unnecessarily, and perhaps most of all, she was in some sense guilty of betrayal of the themes of her work, of the spirit of her writing, inculcated in so many impressionable minds who considered Harry Potter a quintessential part of their formative years. A betrayal of the aspirations of a vulnerable group already subject to intense scrutiny and scorn, and in some wider sense, a betrayal of progressive ideals. She had been as close to a perfect role model, especially for young girls, as it was possible to be. Many would have felt that at a deeply personal level. Why couldn't she have just kept her opinions to herself, instead of adding to the pain and fight for visibility of trans youth? Fuck you, JK Rowling. Changing cultural tides. But it was just at that moment that things began to change. So powerful are these cultural movements, it is almost impossible to discern the earliest shifts. First, there was the Hogwarts Legacy video game. Trans activists and allies had their influence properly tested for the first time, and their efforts to stage some kind of boycott or challenge outlets that reviewed the game positively, or even engaged with it at all, failed abjectly. Everyday gamers were incredulous at the histrionics and efforts of some to judge them for their purchases or opinions of the game, and the so-called boycott was brushed aside. Then, FINA, the international swimming body, decided against allowing trans athletes to perform competitively. Then there came a steady stream of reports and coverage and decisions that turned things around at a remarkable pace. Natalie Wynn, a popular trans YouTuber and political commentator who posts under the username ContraPoints, started trending on Twitter in 2023 when she offered her explanation of why there is no witch hunt against Rowling. The real threat to trans people, Wynn said, is the Republican Party. Rowling and other TERFs are useful idiots who put a concerned female face on the patriarchal violence against trans people that will ultimately be enacted by right-wing men. This is a crucial distinction. The Republican Party and right-wing men were what the trans movement envisaged, even ideally wanted, to be their main opponent. But they weren't. Crucially, and disorientatingly, the trans movement's main challenge turned out to be the highly educated, pedigreed institutionalism they had more or less assumed was on their side, or inevitably coming round to their side. The Tavistock Inquiry. The first real institutional break on the prevailing Affirm First model came with the inquiries into the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, beginning in 2020. What had been treated for years as a pioneering clinical center for trans-identifying youth was suddenly recast as a site of profound professional unease. clinicians reported internal pressure to move rapidly toward medical intervention, even where comorbidities, autism, trauma, were clearly present. Safeguarding processes were inconsistent, psychiatric assessments were truncated, and dissenting practitioners described a culture in which the gender-affirming paradigm overshadowed ordinary clinical judgment. The significance of Tavistock was not merely the clinic itself, but the symbolic rupture. It demonstrated that the medical establishment was not unified, that caution and evidence gathering had been subordinated to ideology, and that the quiet misgivings of professionals were both numerous and long-standing. When the NHS announced the service's closure, it marked the first moment when an official body conceded that the gender care model for minors had drifted too far, too fast. The Cass Report.
A long-awaited review into NHS gender services for children has warned teenagers are falling off a cliff edge when it comes to care. The Cass Review's final report says children have been let down by a lack of research and evidence on medical interventions in gender care.
If Tavistock was the tremor, the Cass Report was the earthquake. Published in 2024 after a multi-year system-wide review, Dr. Hilary Cass's findings constituted the most authoritative repudiation to date of the existing model of pediatric gender medicine. The report concluded that there was no high-quality evidence supporting puberty blockers as a beneficial or even neutral intervention for gender-distressed youth, that the long-term outcomes of medical transition remained deeply uncertain, and that the explosion in referrals, particularly among adolescent girls, could not be understood without reference to social factors. Crucially, Cass insisted that mental health needs had been routinely overshadowed by a doctrinaire focus on gender identity alone. The tone was measured, even cautious, but its implications were devastating. The clinical foundations of the past decade had been built on sand. In public culture, the report functioned as a kind of epistemic permission slip. Ordinary people, long uneasy but intimidated by activist certitudes, saw that the experts themselves were walking the entire field back. The UK Supreme Court ruling. Where Cass repositioned clinical norms, the UK Supreme Court ruling of 2025 reasserted the authority of biological sex in law.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
In upholding a definition of woman grounded in sex rather than self-identification, the court signaled a decisive shift from the legislative ambiguities of the previous decade. The judgment did not arise from cultural panic, but from accumulated legal contradictions. Prisons, sports bodies, single-sex services, and equalities law had been forced into contortions by an identity-based framework that made consistent adjudication impossible. Symbolically, the ruling demonstrated that institutional authority, courts, policymakers, public bodies, was no longer willing to outsource definitions to ideological pressure. In the UK, April 2025 polling finds majorities supporting the Supreme Court ruling that a woman is defined in law as biological sex and backing exclusion of trans women from women's sports and toilets. US polling on medical transition for minors has shifted so that a majority of US adults now oppose medical interventions for trans-identified minors, puberty blockers, surgeries, etc. Attitudes were changing regarding trans athletes. It was the images that made the biggest impression. For example, Glamour magazine accused Rowling of finding and mocking trans athletes. In an especially cruel move, Glamour wrote, she took to Twitter in September 2024 to pick at an Italian Paralympic athlete who was visually impaired and, yes, a trans woman. Valentina Petrillo is a sprinter and an out trans woman, the first to compete in a Paralympic track event. Though she did not even make it to the finals, no offense to Petrillo, who was 51 years old and really not hurting anyone, Rowling took offense, labeling her a cheat. The thing is, Glamour magazine opted not to include an image of Valentina Petrillo, which I will do here. Lastly, recent large-scale surveys of US college undergraduates suggest that the wave of gender nonconformity among young people looks to have already peaked. According to a 2025 analysis by Eric Kaufman, the share of students identifying as transgender or non-binary dropped substantially, from about 6.8% in 2022-2023 to 3 to 3.6% in 2025. Statistically and attitudinally, the tide had absolutely turned. The vindication of JK Rowling. Rowling's lukewarm approach to the right, being largely at a remove from it, has, in the long run, had an enormous payoff. It's a rare instance where the absence of a political flank becomes a reputational asset. She has emerged as a genuinely independent figure. Her stance remains principled, not tribal, and that matters enormously for long-term legitimacy. She maintains the dignity of someone fighting a specific ethical cause rather than a wholesale culture war. As the Cass report reshapes clinical norms, UK courts reaffirm biological sex and law, and polls shift against medicalizing minors, Rowling's stance acquires a retrospective aura of foresight. For history, that matters. Rowling preserved the moral clarity of her position and now stands not as a partisan casualty, but as the rare public intellectual vindicated by time. She divests herself of a problematic two-step realignment with lots of people. Instead of having to breach the psychological barrier of coming around to her views on gender and swallow the idea of conceding to a right-positioned figure, there is only one layer for people to have to go through. This is why Rowling's public rehabilitation is working better than it should, given the scale of the hostility she faced. For most liberal or centrist audiences, step 2, accepting that they are in part siding with a right-identified figure, is the fatal barrier. It triggers tribal identity alarms. It feels like ideological defection. Rowling never imposed that second step. So for people reconsidering her, there is only one step. Do I think she was broadly right on sex and gender? This is why her restoration is smoother than for almost any other cancelled figure of the 2020s. She kept her position culturally untainted by right-wing appropriation, which functions as a kind of permission structure for fence-sitters, moderates, liberals, and even some progressives. As institutional verdicts, the Cass report, court rulings, policy reversals, move in her direction, she becomes easier, not harder, to re-accept. And then something happened that was all at once cathartic and somehow socio-culturally juicy. Emma Watson, stalwart of the transgender cause, who had publicly dissented from Rowling, went on a podcast and tried, yet again, to acknowledge and try to reconcile her feelings toward Rowling as the writer who had given her tremendous opportunities, who was also an outspoken critic of transgender ideology. I really don't believe that by having had that experience and holding the love and support and views that I have means that I can't and don't treasure Jo and the person that I had personal experiences with, Watson said in part. I will never believe that one negates the other and that my experience of that person I don't get to keep and cherish. I just don't know what else to do other than hold these two seemingly incompatible things together at the same time and just hope that maybe they will one day resolve or co-join themselves and maybe accept that they never will, but they can both still be true and I can love her. I can know she loved me. I can be grateful to her. And my job feels like to just hold all of it. But the bigger thing is just what she's done will never be taken away from me. Rowling replied, I'm not owed eternal agreement from any actor who once played a character I created. The idea is as ludicrous as me checking with the boss I had when I was 21 for what opinions I should hold these days. Emma Watson and her co-stars have every right to embrace gender identity ideology. However, Emma and Dan in particular have both made it clear over the last few years that they think our former professional association gives them a particular right, nay obligation, to critique me and my views in public. Years after they finished acting in Potter, they continued to assume the role of de facto spokespeople for the world I created. Like other people who've never experienced adult life uncushioned by wealth and fame, Emma has so little experience of real life, she's ignorant of how ignorant she is. I wasn't a multimillionaire at 14. I lived in poverty while writing the book that made Emma famous. I therefore understand from my own life experience what the trashing of women's rights in which Emma has so enthusiastically participated means to women and girls without her privileges. The greatest irony here is that had Emma not decided in her most recent interview to declare that she loves and treasures me, a change of tack I suspect she's adopted because she's noticed full-throated condemnation of me is no longer quite as fashionable as it was, I might never have been this honest. After years of fractious, emotionally driven, and extremely serious rows over trans ideology, with Rowling constantly in the mix, there was finally something faintly amusing. The sense of Rowling assessing these remarks from Watson as a last straw. Emma Watson had enjoyed cultural establishment affirmation and sympathy for half a decade, during which, out of subsisting fondness, Rowling had largely maintained her silence. While her response, a devastating and unsparing and lengthy post, no doubt was filled with mixed emotions, from a spectator perspective, it was inescapably amusing to see the storm cloud roll in and discharge such an annihilating deluge. It was a seminal moment. The cultural tide was shifting away from Watson. Rowling had come to be seen as vindicated.